Roy Fenner was not a man who stood out in a crowd. He was medium height, medium build, with plain brown hair that was starting to go gray at the sides. His hands were his best feature, steady and careful, the kind of hands that never rushed. He had run his barber shop on the quiet end of Duskvale's main street for 11 years, and in those 11 years, almost nothing unusual had ever happened to him. He liked it that way. The shop was small but clean. 2 chairs, 1 mirror, a shelf of combs and scissors, and a little iron stove in the corner that kept the place warm through the cold months. Roy opened every morning at the same time, swept the floor before the first customer came in, and closed every evening when the light got too low to work properly. He hummed while he worked. Always the same 3 songs. His mother had taught them to him when he was a boy, and he had never found any reason to learn different ones. Duskvale sat right on the edge of the borderlands, where the flat farming country met the rocky hills to the east. It was not a wealthy town and it was not a famous one. But it had something that most towns did not. On the west side of town, past the old flour mill and the stone bridge, there was a Drake settlement. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Long low dens built from dark stone, wide open ground where the Drakes could stretch and move, and a fire that burned in the center of the settlement every single night without fail. The humans of Duskvale and the Drake kind were not close. But they were not enemies either. They shared the market on Saturdays. They nodded to each other on the road. If a human child wandered too close to the settlement, a Drake would quietly guide them back without making a scene. If a Drake needed something from the human side of town, they came and got it and paid fairly and left. It was not warmth exactly. It was something older and quieter than warmth. It was the kind of peace that comes from 2 groups of people deciding, without ever saying it out loud, that getting along costs less than fighting. Roy had no strong feelings about any of it. He cut hair for whoever sat in his chair. A few of the younger Drakes had come in once, curious about his scissors and the way he used them. He had let them watch. One of them had even sat in the chair and let Roy trim the thin fringe of hide around its jaw. Roy had done it carefully and charged the same price he charged everyone else. The Drake had seemed pleased. That was the end of it. The night everything changed, Roy had stayed late. A shelf bracket above the mirror had been wobbling for a week and he had finally gotten tired of looking at it. He had stayed after closing to fix it properly, working slowly in the lamplight with a small hammer and a handful of screws. It took longer than he expected. By the time he pulled on his coat and picked up his key, the street outside was fully dark and the town had gone quiet around him. He locked the front door, turned up his collar against the cold, and started toward the back of the building where he kept his supply box stored under the rear overhang. That was when he heard it. He stopped walking. The sound was small. Very small. It was coming from the narrow gap between the back wall of his shop and the old storage shed that belonged to the grain merchant next door. The gap was maybe 2 feet wide, dark, and usually full of nothing but dead leaves and cold air. Roy stood still and listened. The sound came again. Thin and weak and shivering. Like something very young that had been cold for too long and was running out of the strength to even make noise. He walked to the gap and crouched down and looked in. 3 baby Drakes were pressed together against the warm stone of his back wall. They were tiny. Each one was small enough that Roy could have tucked it under one arm. Their scales, which should have been bright, were pale and dull from the cold. Their small sides were moving fast with shallow breathing. Their eyes were open but only halfway, and the look in them was not fear exactly. It was something worse than fear. It was the blank and heavy look of creatures that had simply run out of warmth and were too tired to do anything about it. They saw Roy crouching there in the dark. None of them moved. None of them made a sound. Roy looked at them for a moment. His breath came out in a pale cloud in the cold air. He thought about going to find someone from the Drake settlement. He thought about calling for the town guard. He thought about a lot of things in about 4 seconds. Then he stood up, went back inside his shop, put the kettle on the stove, found the softest cloth he owned, and cut it into 3 rough pieces. He came back out and sat down on the cold ground in the alley. Not grabbing. Not rushing. Just sitting close, letting the warmth of his body move through the dark air toward them. The smallest one moved first. Crawling slowly, unsteady, drawn by the heat it could not resist. It pressed against Roy's side and stopped moving. The second followed. Then the third. Roy wrapped the cloth pieces around them one by one, loose and gentle. He leaned his back against the wall and held still. By the time the last lamp on the street went dark, all 3 baby drakes were asleep on his chest. Roy looked up at the cold sky and decided everything else could wait until morning. Roy was not a man who panicked easily. He had learned that a long time ago, in the quiet way most ordinary people learn things about themselves. Not through any great test or grand moment, but through small ones. A cut that would not stop bleeding. A customer who fainted in the chair. A fire in the shop next door that everyone else ran from while Roy grabbed a bucket. He had never decided to be calm in those moments. He had simply found, each time, that he already was. So when he looked down and saw 3 baby drakes pressed against his sides in the cold dark alley, his heart did not race. His hands did not shake. He breathed in slowly, breathed out slowly, and stayed exactly where he was. The smallest one had its face tucked against Roy's ribs. He could feel it trembling. Not from fear now. From cold that had gone too deep and would take time to leave. The other 2 were pressed close on either side, their small bodies rising and falling with fast, shallow breaths. They were not well. They were not in danger of dying, Roy thought, but they were close enough to the edge of it that moving them roughly or frightening them now would not help anyone. He reached very slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out the cloth pieces he had cut inside. He moved like a man defusing something. No sudden motion. No sound. He laid one piece over the smallest one first, tucking it loosely so the warmth could build underneath without pressing too hard on the small body. Then he did the same for the one on his left. Then the one on his right. None of them pulled away. None of them made a sound. Roy leaned his head back against the stone wall and looked up at the narrow strip of night sky visible between the 2 buildings. It was a clear night. Cold and sharp and full of stars. He could see his breath rising in slow pale clouds above him. His back was already starting to ache from the hard ground and the awkward angle, but he shifted carefully and found a position that was not quite as bad, and stayed there. He thought about the Drake settlement across town. Someone over there was awake right now, he was almost certain of it. The fire in the center of the settlement never went out. There was always at least one elder Drake sitting beside it through the night. He could go there now, tell them what he had found, and be back in his warm bed within the hour. But he looked down at the 3 small creatures on his chest and he did not move. They had come to his wall. Not to the settlement. Not to anyone else on the street. They had pressed themselves against the warmest thing they could find in the dark, which happened to be the back wall of his shop, heated all day by the iron stove inside. They had not chosen him exactly. But they had ended up with him. And right now, the safest thing for them was not movement. It was stillness and warmth and the sound of a slow, calm heartbeat. Roy could provide all 3 of those things without any trouble at all. He closed his eyes and focused on keeping his breathing even and deep. He had read once, years ago in some book a customer had left behind, that young animals could feel the heartbeat of whatever they were resting against. That a slow heart told them the world was safe. That a fast one told them to run. He did not know if that was true for drakes. He did not know very much about drakes at all, if he was honest. But it cost him nothing to try. He breathed in for 4 counts. Out for 4 counts. Slow and steady. The trembling in the smallest one began to ease after a while. Roy felt it happen gradually, the tiny body going from tight and shaking to soft and loose. The fast shallow breathing slowed down. The small chest began to rise and fall in longer, quieter waves. The other two followed, one at a time, over the next half hour. Roy sat in the dark alley and listened to the town sleep around him. A dog barked somewhere far away and then went quiet. Wind moved through the gap between the buildings and Roy pulled his coat tighter with one careful hand, making sure not to disturb the cloth pieces over the babies. His fingers were getting cold. His jaw was tight. He thought about the kettle he had left on the stove inside and whether the water had boiled away by now. He thought about a lot of things to keep his mind busy while his body stayed still. He thought about his mother, who used to say that the most useful thing a person could do in any difficult moment was simply to stay. Not to fix. Not to solve. Just to stay and be steady and let the difficult moment pass at its own speed. He had thought about that a lot over the years. He thought about it now. Around midnight, the cold deepened. Roy felt it press through his coat and settle into his shoulders and the backs of his legs. The stone beneath him was hard and unforgiving. His back ached in a dull, steady way that he knew would be worse in the morning. He shifted by half an inch and stopped when one of the babies stirred, and then waited until it settled again before he let himself breathe fully. All three were deeply asleep now. Their breathing was slow and even and warm against his chest. The trembling was completely gone. The pale dullness in their scales had eased a little, replaced by something that looked almost like the faint shimmer that healthy young drakes were supposed to have. Roy looked down at them in the dark. Then he leaned his head back against the wall, closed his eyes, and stayed exactly where he was until morning came. The sun came up slowly over Dusk Vale, pale and cold, the way winter suns always did in the borderlands. Roy had not slept much. Maybe an hour, maybe two, sitting against the alley wall with his back aching and his legs stiff and three small warm weights on his chest. When the light finally came gray and thin between the buildings, he moved carefully, the way a man moves when he is carrying something he does not want to wake. He got to his feet in slow stages. He cradled the three babies against his chest with one arm, unlocked the back door of his shop with the other hand, and stepped inside. The stove had gone low but there were still coals. He added wood with one hand, keeping the babies pressed against him with the other arm. The shop warmed quickly. Roy settled into his barber chair, the big one nearest the stove, and arranged the three small drakes across his lap and against his chest the way they had been in the alley. They stirred a little at the movement but did not wake. He pulled his working apron off the hook beside the chair and laid it over them like a blanket. Then he sat there in the warming shop and waited for the town to wake up. He heard it before he saw it. The sound came from the direction of the west side of town, past the mill. It started low, like wind through a narrow place, and then grew into something fuller and more urgent. Roy had lived in Dusk Vale long enough to know the difference between ordinary morning noise and the sound of something wrong. This was the sound of something wrong. He heard boots on the street outside. Fast ones. Then voices, sharp and clipped. Then the deep resonant calls of drake kind moving in numbers, a sound that carried through walls and glass and settled in the chest like a struck bell. Roy looked down at the three babies under his apron. He put two and two together fairly quickly. Through the front window of his shop he could see the street filling up. Drake warriors moved in pairs, stopping at doorways, looking down alleys, checking behind carts and barrels. They were large and efficient and their eyes moved fast over everything. Two town guardsmen jogged past, looking slightly panicked in the way that humans always looked when something involving the Drakes got complicated. Roy watched all of it from his chair and did not move. He told himself he would get up in a moment and go to the door and call out to someone and explain the situation. He told himself that several times over the next little while. But every time he started to shift his weight, one of the babies would press closer in its sleep, or make a small soft sound, and Roy would stop and wait, and somehow the moment would pass without him having moved at all. He was still sitting there when old Dara came down the street. Roy had seen the Drake matriarch before, the way everyone in Dusk Vale had seen her, from a distance and usually briefly. She was old. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Old in the way mountains were old, in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with time and weight and the particular kind of authority that only came from surviving long enough to see everything change around you while you stayed the same. She was large even by Drake's standards. Her scales had gone dark with age, almost black in the morning light, with patches of deep bronze at the edges. She moved through the street without hurrying, but the street seemed to move around her. People stepped back without thinking about it. The younger Drake warriors adjusted their paths without being told. Even the town guardsmen, who were supposed to be keeping order, found reasons to be on the other side of the street when she passed. Her eyes moved over everything. Missing nothing. Roy watched her stop at the mouth of the alley beside his shop. She looked down it. She looked at the marks in the thin frost on the ground, the small impressions where 3 tiny bodies had huddled against his wall through the night. She was still for a long moment, reading something in those marks that Roy probably would not have been able to read himself. Then she raised her head and looked directly at the front window of his shop. Roy felt the look land on him like a hand on his shoulder. He did not look away. There was no point in looking away. He simply sat in his barber chair with his apron over his lap and 3 baby drakes asleep underneath it and met the matriarch's gaze through the glass as steadily as he could manage. Dara looked at him for a long moment. Then she began walking toward his door. Roy heard her speak to the warriors around her in low Drake tongue. He did not understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. She was telling them to wait outside. The warriors stopped where they were. A few of the townspeople nearby looked at each other with wide eyes. One of the guardsmen took a step toward the shop door and then stopped, clearly unsure whether getting involved would help or make things considerably worse. Roy straightened slightly in his chair. He looked down at the 3 babies one more time. The smallest one had its chin resting on his forearm. Its eyes were still closed. Its breathing was slow and deep and perfectly peaceful. Roy pulled the apron up a little higher, covering them more completely. He looked at the door. The handle turned. He heard the familiar small creak that the hinges always made, the one he kept meaning to oil and kept forgetting about. The morning air came in, cold and sharp. And old Dara stepped inside. Dara had lived for a very long time. She had seen wars begin and end. She had watched forests burn and grow back. She had buried elders she had known since she was young, and she had raised hatchlings who were now elders themselves. She had seen things that should have surprised her and found, most of the time, that they did not. Time had a way of doing that. It wore the sharp edges off surprise until almost nothing could cut through anymore. But she stopped completely when she stepped through the door of Roy Fenner's barber shop. She stopped the way a person stops when they see something that does not fit inside any box they already have. Not because it was frightening. Because it was so entirely unexpected that her mind needed an extra moment just to take it in properly. There was a man sitting in a barber chair. A plain, ordinary-looking man with brown hair going gray at the sides and the kind of face that belonged to someone who fixed things quietly and never talked about it. He had an apron laid across his lap. And from underneath that apron came 3 small familiar shapes, rising and falling with the slow deep breathing of creatures in a very good sleep. Her grandchildren. All 3 of them. Safe. Warm. Completely unbothered by the panic that had turned the entire town upside down since before sunrise. The man looked up at her. He did not jump. He did not go pale. He did not begin talking immediately the way most people did when they found themselves looking at Dara for the first time at close range. He simply looked at her with calm, tired eyes, the eyes of someone who had been awake most of the night and had made his peace with that, and he raised one hand slowly and pressed a single finger to his lips. Quiet. Please. Dara did not move. She stood in the doorway of the small warm shop and looked at the man and then looked at her grandchildren and then looked at the man again. Behind her she could feel the presence of her warriors waiting on the street. She could hear the townspeople who had gathered, keeping their distance, whispering to each other in the way humans did when they were trying to understand something. She did not turn around. She did not take her eyes off the barber chair. She stepped inside and let the door close behind her. The shop was warm. Much warmer than outside. There was a stove in the corner with good steady heat coming off it and the smell of wood smoke and something else, something clean and simple that she could not name. The walls had tools hung on them. Scissors and combs and small bottles. A mirror along one wall reflecting the morning light. Everything neat. Everything in its place. She walked closer, slowly, and looked down at her grandchildren. The smallest one, Little Fun, was tucked against the man's left side with its chin resting on his forearm. Its scales had color in them again. Good color. The pale dullness from the cold was gone. Its breathing was long and slow and deep in the way that young drakes only breathed when they felt completely safe. The other two, Bryn and the one everyone called Spot for the mark behind its left ear, were draped across the man's lap under the apron, pressed together, utterly still. Dara had been looking for them since before dawn. She had not slept. She had moved through the town with her heart doing something she did not often allow it to do, something close to fear, and she had kept that fear pressed down and quiet under the fury because fury was more useful. Fury made you move. Fear made you freeze. But looking at them now, asleep and warm and safe, she felt the fury go out of her like air from a punctured thing. It left quickly and completely, and what came in behind it was something else entirely. Something that sat heavy and soft behind her eyes. She did not let it show. She was very practiced at that. Roy watched her look at them. He did not say anything. He did not try to explain himself or justify what he had done or list the reasons why she should not be angry with him. He just watched her with those calm tired eyes and kept his hands still and his breathing even so the babies would not stir. Dara looked at him for a long moment. She had dealt with many humans over the years. Many different kinds. The loud ones and the careful ones, the ones who wanted something and the ones who were afraid and the ones who pretended they were not afraid when they very clearly were. She had learned to read them the way she read weather. Most of them she could place quickly. This one was harder to place. He had found her grandchildren in the cold and dark. He had not come to the settlement to report it. He had not gone to the town guard. He had not done anything that would draw attention to himself or make himself important in the story. He had simply sat down on the cold ground and stayed, through the whole of the night, so three small creatures he had no connection to could sleep safely on his chest. She looked at his coat. It was still on him. He had never taken it off. He had kept it on through the night to hold the warmth in, for them. His hands, she noticed, were red from the cold. His shoulders had the tight careful look of someone whose back had been hurting for hours and who had not moved to fix it because moving would have disturbed the one sleeping on him. Dara pulled the chair from the corner slowly and set it across from him and sat down. Roy blinked. He had not expected that. She folded her large dark hands in her lap and looked at him steadily. Then, in careful and deliberate human speech, she said, "Tell me your name." It was not a demand exactly. But it was not quite a question either. Roy looked at her. Then he glanced down at the sleeping babies one more time. Then he looked back up. "Roy," he said quietly. "Roy Fenner." Dara nodded once, slowly, as if she was placing the name somewhere she would not forget it. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The stove ticked quietly in the corner. Outside, the town waited. Inside the small warm shop, three baby drakes slept on without knowing any of it. Dara sat with Roy for a little while longer. She did not explain herself and he did not ask her to. They sat in the quiet warmth of the small shop while the town moved and murmured outside and the three babies slept on, completely unaware that the most important drake in Duskvale was sitting 4 feet away watching over them. It was a strange kind of peace, the sort that settles between two people who do not know each other at all but have somehow ended up on the same side of something without planning to. After a while Dara leaned forward in her chair. She moved with the particular slowness that she had learned over many years, the slowness of someone who understood that sudden movement near sleeping young things was never a good idea regardless of the species. She reached out and lifted the first baby with both hands, cradling it the way only someone who had held many hatchlings could, supporting the full weight evenly, keeping it pressed close and warm. The baby stirred. Its small claws flexed once. Then it tucked its chin down and went still again, finding the familiar warmth of her hold and deciding without waking that everything was fine. She lifted the second one. Then the third. She held all 3 against her chest, one arm under them, the other curved around them, and she stood. Roy stood at the same time. He did it in stages. First he shifted his weight forward in the chair. Then he put one hand on the armrest and pushed himself up. His back made its feelings very clear about the whole process. It had been telling him for the last 2 hours that last night had been a poor decision for a man his age, and it was not done making that point. He straightened up slowly, vertebra by vertebra, until he was standing fully upright. His face did not change much. His jaw tightened briefly and then relaxed. He did not say anything about it. He reached up and took his apron off the back of the chair and hung it on its hook. Dara watched him do all of this. She had been watching him since she walked in the careful way she watched everything, storing details the way some people stored firewood, against a future need. She had watched him through the whole quiet time they sat together. The way he checked on the babies without making it obvious. The way he kept his voice low and his movements small. The way he had not once asked her for anything, not for thanks, not for explanation, not for acknowledgement of any kind. She looked at him now, standing in the middle of his small shop, a plain tired man with a sore back and red hands and no particular expression on his face, and she made a decision. She spoke. The word she used was drake tongue, old drake tongue, the kind that had not changed in several hundred years. It was not a long word. It was a single sound, low and resonant, that sat in the air of the small shop for a moment after she said it the way a struck bell sits in the air after the hammer falls. Roy looked at her. He did not understand the word. That was clear from his face. Dara considered how to explain it. In drake tongue the word described a specific kind of person. Not a hero. Not a protector in the formal sense. Something quieter than either of those. It described someone who held a thing carefully when it needed holding, not because they were asked, not because there was any reward in it, but simply because the thing needed holding and they were there and it was the right thing to do. There was no clean human word for it. She had checked, over the years. The closest anyone had ever managed in the human tongue was a whole sentence. One who holds without being asked. She said that part in his language, slowly, so he would understand what the drake word meant. Roy looked at her for a moment. Then he looked slightly to the side, the way people did when something landed on them that they were not quite sure what to do with. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he nodded once, a small nod, and looked back at her. He did not say thank you. She did not say it either. It was not that kind of moment. Dara carried her grandchildren to the door. Roy stepped ahead of her and opened it, holding it wide so she could pass through without having to shift the babies. She paused in the doorway and looked back at him one more time. Then she walked out into the street. The effect was immediate. The warriors outside straightened and pressed forward and then stopped when they saw the babies safe and sleeping. The townspeople who had gathered made a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a sigh but something in between. The 2 town guardsmen looked at each other with the relieved expressions of men who had been dreading paperwork. Roy stood in his doorway and watched Dara walk back up the street toward the mill and the settlement beyond it. She did not look back again. She walked the way she always walked, steadily and without hurry, as if the world adjusted itself around her rather than the other way around. He watched until she was gone from sight. Then he went back inside, put the kettle on, and sat down in his barber chair. 3 days later he came to open his shop in the morning and found something hanging above the door that had not been there the night before. It was small, carved from dark stone, shaped like a curled drake with its wings folded close. The carving was old work, careful and detailed, the kind that took a long time and steady hands. There was no note. There did not need to be one. Roy looked at it for a moment. Then he unlocked his door and went inside and began his day the same way he always did, sweeping the floor, warming the stove, humming the same 3 songs his mother had taught him. Above the door the small stone drake turned slightly in the morning wind. And it stayed there.